Welcome to the Low Carb MD Podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Welcome to another Low Carb MD Podcast. We're doing another journal club here. This is going to be great. We're going to be talking about a hot topic. This is going to be about erythritol. And if you haven't caught the episode with Dr. Adrian Soto and Dr. Nick Norwitz, this will be a great sort of addition to that. And we're joined here by two awesome people who I love. If you guys don't know them by now, Dr. Laura Buchanan, we've done 4 journal clubs together. And we're joined also by Dr. Matt Calkins, just two brilliant people who are going to break the science down for us and go journal. We're going to dissect this. In this journal club, we're going to dissect this newest article from Nature Medicine, and we're going to sort of bring it back through the history of all the info we have on erythritol and sort of help make sense of what do we know now, what don't we know, and what should we do. So, guys, before we get started, it's nice to have you again.
Always a pleasure.
Nice to be here.
This is a great thing to do on a Saturday afternoon.
So first things first, there's going to be a lot of, people who are listening to the podcast who want to catch all the slides that we're going to be talking about. We're going to do our best to make it, this information accessible to you, but you can go to YouTube, look up Low Carb MD Podcast, and you can actually see some of these slides. And with that said, Matt, take us through, this bombshell that's all over CNN and it's all over the news and the headlines. What was your first blush before we get into the science? What was your first blush? What did you think? What was your, initial reactions, before you sort of once you read the abstract of the paper, what did you think?
Yeah, I think honestly, it was a very controversial paper. You saw people on Twitter or just social media in general falling into really distinct two camps, either proponents or opponents. And at first, I was definitely very surprised by the data, and I was very much against erythritol. And then as I continued to do this journal club, I would say that my view on erythritol has softened. I would still, not to spoil the end of everything, I would still say precautionary principle is always best, but I went from pretty much 100% staunchly against it to just being really more frustrated that it's taken this long to get this level of data on it anyways.
Dr. Laura, so what do you think? First blush, you see this Nature Med article, all these headlines, immediately I'm thinking, oh my conspiratorial brain's like, they did the same thing with TMAO. They did the same thing. We don't know if sugar is good or bad. We don't know if, eggs are good or bad. Meat's been bad. Now it's good. Immediately I thought, oh, here we go. Another ingredient, another biomarker. And, it didn't help that the lead author is anti-meat. So, but then, I sort of changed my tune. So what was your first reaction?
First reaction, it was a little bit of whiplash and thinking, oh man, because I don't consume a ton of erythritol, but it is one of my go-to. And when I bake goods and I try to stay keto, that's one of the ones I'm using. And I have a ginger ale that's 15 grams of erythritol and no sugar, doesn't do anything with my blood sugar. And I was thinking, oh, I'm pouring that down the drain. So that was my first instinct.
Okay, so your first instinct was like, okay, my first instinct was a little, who are these people? What are they trying to show? What are they, right? And then immediately I went to the literature and refreshed on all the studies I've seen in the past, which maybe we'll go through now. And some of those are that it improves endothelial dysfunction in diabetics and it's safe in kids. And so that was the data we had sort of before, but I sort of refreshed myself just to get a full, point of view. So Matt, why don't you just walk us through sort of, the data, sort of the studies that you've aggregated and walk us through how we should be thinking about this critically in a sort of a journal club format?
Yeah. So excellent. And of course, you two can chime in anytime, because otherwise it's going to be about 15 minutes of me talking. And then we have the discussion slides at the very end, but we can discuss things as we go through. So for this particular journal club, we're going to review the study. Then we're going to discuss the history of erythritol. And then we're going to go to the discussion where I have a couple of points to consider from all of those above. And so essentially the background for people who don't know, before this study, there's actually not much evidence for or against the safety of these artificial sweeteners. These are polyols, which are specifically sugar alcohols in humans. We have some acute mouse studies lasting a couple of weeks, fed really high doses of these things. And there's no acute effects, like no cancers acutely or other things, but the long-term data is severely lacking. And you might know other polyols or sugar alcohols as erythritol, sorbitol, xylitol, and mannitol. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that erythritol is made in the human body, as well as you have the ability to get it in your diet. So this isn't like some biomarker where you literally can only get it from your diet. And if it's in your blood, it's only from your diet. Your body makes this. And we're going to go over why your body makes this.
So it's not like cadmium, which you definitely don't want in your bloodstream because it's associated with heart disease, and it's found in lots of different chocolates and chocolate powders. But this is something your body makes. But our body makes a lot of things. Our body makes hydrochloric acid. Our body makes a whole host of substances that aren't exactly it's not like we should be ingesting hydrochloric acid. So I've heard this appeal to nature, like your body makes it. Do you think that that's something we should consider from like a scientific perspective, or do you mean it in the sense like our bodies have a mechanism to make these and clear these?
I mean it as a mechanism in the fact that when we measure in the blood, we have no idea where it's really coming from. We do have a small idea, but honestly, it's not up to the level of academic, rigorous, scientific data that I would need to really say it's either definitively causing or not causing all of these things that we're going to be talking about. It just purely from a scientific measurement type of standpoint.
So it's sort of like our bodies make sugar, and sugar is quote unquote natural and found in natural substances. But when our bodies can't process and handle these appropriately, high levels are associated with disease, which we know. And so I guess at the end of the day, it's what is healthy, what is a healthy amount, and what's not.
Exactly.
Okay. Yep.
So then going to the study, this study was actually 3 studies rolled into one. So the first study in the study, this first sub-study, is basically observational data that links blood levels of erythritol with cardiovascular disease. The second part of the study is platelet function, both in humans, but also in test tubes. And then also the last sub-study is a essential loading erythritol dose and then measuring how high humans' erythritol levels get after a loading dose of 30 grams. Perfect. So this is kind of the triangle we're going to talk about, and we're going to go in the same order that the authors went in, which is going to be erythritol and CBD first. Then we'll talk about the platelets. Then we'll talk about the loading dose. So
that's one of the things I want to bring up is that this is, you say 3 studies. It was actually 8 studies, a lot of different registered clinical trials. There was at least 4 registered clinical trials, 3 of which were different observational studies packaged into one. So when I'm hearing, these claims on sort of mainstream woke nutrition videos that are coming out on YouTube, it's saying, oh, this is all, this is one study. And then they focus on just the epidemiology. And it's like everybody is ignoring everything else. So I appreciate you going through everything.
Yeah, for the purposes of the journal club, I broke it up into 3, but it's very obvious that this was at least a half-decade long project with bench research, with observational research, and with almost clinical bedside research with the 30-gram loading dose. So it's a pretty impressive collection of studies. The observational part of this is the 3 cohorts was a discovery cohort, a US validation cohort, and a European cohort. So for the discovery cohort, they literally took almost 1,000 people, took their blood and just ran analyses on it and looked at incident cardiovascular disease with almost every metabolite that they could measure. And this is just a sample of the different molecules in the appendix of the paper that they looked at. But erythritol is all the way up here at the top. So right here.
So help me break this down, because so they controlled for other sweeteners that may be found in the blood. Is that correct? Is that how they adjusted this? Tell me if I interpret it incorrectly.
I think so the one thing I don't think they did really a great job on is discussing exactly what they adjusted for in both their observational data. In their observational data, I should say. I know they adjusted for CVD risk factors, which is kind of a broad term, and they didn't really define that from what I could find, even in their appendix. I think this was literally just an all-comers, and then taking the multiplicity. So they basically took these p-values and made sure that they accounted for looking at multiple comparisons and then seeing which ones had basically the lowest p-values and seeing which ones were most correlative. What was your understanding?
Yeah, so I got to go back and review it, but I think they controlled for some other, some of the like xylose levels. So they basically controlled for people who had only high erythritol. I have to look at it again versus some of these other things. I have to review it again.
Yeah.
I didn't prepare enough for this journal club.
No worries.
Laura, Dr. Laura, what did you think about their sort of adjustments?
So I thought I remember reading about how they controlled for CVD risk factors. I don't remember reading that they controlled for the other tons of different biomarkers that they were evaluating for.
So while you go on, I'm going to actually look up their adjustments. So while you keep going, I'll look that up so we can keep things going.
Excellent. Perfect. So for the discovery cohort, they had the 3-year outcome data, and they found that the hazard ratio for erythritol compared to the highest quartile with the lowest quartile was 3.22. And over here on the bottom right, you can actually see that it's not really dose dependent. It's really only statistically significant for when you compare Q1 to Q4. And MACE in this case which is the major adverse cardiac event, was defined as death, non-fatal myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, or a stroke following the enrollment of this study.
And Q1 just means the lowest range of levels of erythritol, and Q4 is the highest level, breaking it up into quartile ranges. Yeah,
essentially 4 bins of intake, comparing the lowest bin to the highest bin. This is the US validation cohort. This had over 2,000 people in it. They also noted in this one that at baseline, if we just measured your erythritol and it was high, you likely had a higher risk of having pre-existing cardiovascular disease. So that's one thing to note, that people who had higher erythritols in general were sicker. Additionally, this data set was collected at or around the time erythritol was introduced into the US food supply. So the vast majority of these people most likely did not have a lot of erythritol intake in their diet at this point. They mentioned that in more of the discussion. For this one, comparing the highest bin to the lowest bin, you have a hazard ratio of 2.64 unadjusted, but when they adjust for traditional cardiovascular disease risk factors, it was a hazard ratio of 1.8. They also went on to do a continuous variable, and for each 1 micromole increase of the xylitol or the erythritol, it increased your hazard ratio by 21% for your MACE. And then up here, they showed the log of erythritol. And I just like to convert these into like natural units to just make sure that it makes sense. And you can see this incredible span of difference in the amount of erythritol in people's blood, going from almost, they actually said here, the quartile 1 down here on the bottom right was less than 3.75 intake, and quartile 4 had between 5.97 up to 46. So that's a pretty large span between the quartiles.
So I just looked up, I completely made an error here. I looked to see, I thought they used one of these substances as a control, but which actually would have been smart if they did. It would have adjusted probably better, but they didn't. Their only adjustments were, I'm going to bring it up here, body mass, LDL, HDL, let's see, triglycerides, diabetes, smoking, blood pressure, age, and gender. So they could have used some other sort of marker and controlled for that. That a user of erythritol would have consumed. So they could have adjusted for, let's say, saccharin in the blood, or they could have adjusted for, aspartame in the blood, and this would have really sort of taken out any of the user bias, right? Because anybody who would have used erythritol would have used those other items, right? And so you'd be hypothetically taking away the disease state that may increase erythritol. Does that make sense? I mean, I would have liked to see that. I thought they did that.
It would have been interesting to see the uncontrolled data versus the controlled data for that. Yeah. All right. And then finally, the European validation cohort was 800 people. I think the most important thing from this slide to just take away is that the hazard ratio was 4.5, almost 4.5 when you unadjusted, and then it came down to 2.2 when you adjusted for the cardiovascular disease risk factors. The other thing to note as well is that the quartile 4 in this particular group, the highest value was 137. So just real quick, comparing that to the US cohort down here on the bottom right, which is 47, all the way up to 137 for the European cohort. This data was also obtained later on, more close in time to when erythritol was introduced. So these people were at higher possibility of ingesting more erythritol in their diet. They also found that you had a continuous increase of 16% in your hazard ratio for your adverse events per 1 micromole increase. And finally, this is just putting it all on one page. We already discussed everything. The top left, you have the discovery cohort with the hazard ratio of 3.2. The middle of the page, you have the hazard ratio for the US cohort of 1.8 adjusted. And then the hazard ratio on the right for the European cohort was 2.2. All right, so that's the first part that they went over, which was the observational data. The second part was the effect of erythritol.
Can you help put the listener, you said the hazard ratio is around 2, right? So what are other things that are around the hazard ratio of 2? Just to give an idea of, to the average listener, what does that mean? What are other things that, you got a slide for it? Okay.
Yeah, so I jumped ahead a little bit in my lecture. I was anticipating this, Tro.
Yeah.
So I just had a couple of thoughts as I was going through this, specifically how much we've investigated other nutrients and found that there have been small or no, in some cases, risk of cardiovascular disease versus what we're seeing with this kind of information. So the first one is going to be erythritol, and with the mechanism of harm theoretically being the platelet activation, creating a hazard ratio of 1.2 to 2.2 for heart disease. The next thing would be TMAO, which currently the mechanism would be up in the air, and the CVD, the hazard ratio of that is 1.6. Trans fats, which they say is due to LDL and other multiple mechanisms, is 1.5. And then saturated fat, which mechanism of harm is theoretically LDL, has a cardiovascular disease hazard ratio of 0 based on Ronald Krauss's meta-analysis that was done earlier this decade. So I want you to think about how many other studies, how many publications do we have on both saturated fat and TMAO? How many, just the absolute mind-boggling amount of time and money spent on these two nutrients, and for relatively either 0 prediction in the case of saturated fat, or just this very nuanced discussion on the TMAO. And we right here have this much higher hazard ratio for erythritol.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think we can get myopic in nutrition, right? And everybody wants a publication. And sometimes, investigating truth is the same thing in like journalism, investigating truth sometimes is very difficult. But, to your point, are there, remind me, the hazard ratio for smoking is about 2.2, if I believe, right? It's something like that. It's something close to that. And the hazard ratio of, say, obesity is probably around 4, and diabetes is probably around 5 or 6 or maybe 7. I forget, something like that, right?
LPIR is like 8 to 12, depending on how old you are.
Yeah. Okay. So it kind of matters, right? Kind of matters. Maybe we're unclear.
Yes. Which is why I think it's important to talk probably about the molecular mechanisms that happen, but also what we've known about erythritol from prior. So the next part was the effect on platelets. This is important because one of the first steps of a heart attack is thrombosis, which by definition, you have platelets clumping together, which is called aggregation. And in fact, when somebody comes in with a heart attack to the emergency department, you always hear, we give a big aspirin, a 325 milligram aspirin, and we sometimes give Plavix if we think they're not going for a bypass. Both of those medicines work to just stop platelets from clumping together. So the opposite is going to be really important for predicting heart disease. And they looked at platelet aggregation, activation, adhesion molecules, Petri dish clotting, and also mouse clotting. There's carotid arteries specifically with erythritol. So the moral of all of this platelet data is that erythritol worsens. They make platelets more sticky and they activate the platelets, and they make people clot flat. They make mice clot faster. So the first study, they just gave erythritol up to 270 micromole, which saw a 2-fold increase in platelet aggregation. And then they also had these very important metrics of platelet adhesion, which is 2B3A and P-selectin. All these means are, these are just little molecules that platelets use to stick to each other. And there's a dose response relationship from going from 0 to 4.5, 18, 45, 90, and 270 doses of erythritol in the blood, of blood erythritol levels. Okay. The next thing they did is they put a little bit of erythritol with blood on these collagen chips. And they saw that this, if you look at the slide, if you're able to watch along with this green fluorescent pattern shows that you have more adhesion of these platelets to the slide. For essentially people who can't look at this at home, one of these slides has it's essentially black, which is the placebo. It has almost no adhesion on it. And then the other one has a ton of adhesion. It looks like it's almost an order of 3 to 4 times more adhesion with the erythritol at only 45 micromole concentration. And then this is the last one. This is the study they did in the mice. They essentially just measured the time it took to clot off the carotid artery. They gave these mice 290, they made their blood concentration 290 micromole of erythritol. And then it took 9 minutes and 30 seconds for their carotid artery to clot off, while it took placebo 13 minutes and 40 seconds.
Just as comparison, you said the European cohort, the highest their micromole was 137.
Yes. Yep. And I have at the end of this slide, at the end of this lecture, I have a nice table that's going to summarize all of these findings in terms of the amounts of the erythritol. And I think that's going to help people put this into perspective too. And we can go over the numbers then as well. But 290 will be important to keep in mind for the next slide, because we're going to talk about how high do your blood levels get after you take in 30 grams of erythritol in, let's say, like a drink or a bar. So this final part of their study, they used 8 healthy subjects. They gave them 30 grams of erythritol, and within 30 minutes, their concentrations of erythritol in their blood increased from about 4,000 to nearly 10,000 micromoles in their blood. As Laura just pointed out on the last slide, we had these mice at 290 micromoles compared to about 5,000 on this slide. And Tro brought up a good point at the beginning. These levels do not return back to normal until day 3 to 7, and they remain elevated for almost a day above, up to 2 days above any level of increasing platelet activation or aggregation, all the way through day 7.
I mean, that to me is, this is sort of like the clinical side.
Yeah.
It's not like a one-time hit. It's sort of like, hey, look, this relatively normal hit results in high and persistently high blood levels. And those blood levels are associated with, platelet aggregation, which are the mechanisms that we use to treat people, like you mentioned. I mean, these are acting on the ways we treat people to prevent heart disease.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's just it's lining up physiology and epidemiology for me in a bit enough to make me say that this is more than just healthy user bias. But let's see where it goes. Let's see where the data takes us.
I agree. All right. So that's it. We just covered everything for this paper. We already covered this slide, just comparing the other hazard ratios to more traditional cardiovascular disease hazard ratios. And so next we're going to move into the history of erythritol and looking at a couple of studies to put this into perspective. So erythritol was FDA approved in 2001. I believe it was introduced in Japan in the early 90s. So we were about a decade later than I think Japan, but I think Japan was one of the first countries to really introduce this to their food supply. The paper mentions that in 2014, the erythritol intake for some individuals in the US was up to 30 grams per day, which is concordant with the loading dose that we saw in the study. And that's based on observational data. And then it was generally recognized as safe by the FDA in 2018. So the 5 papers, there's 4 studies and then 1 review paper I wanted to touch on. We're going to talk about metabolomics, which was a relatively new field of research in medicine. It's this kind of the same first study they did with the discovery cohort. You're just literally measuring almost everything in somebody's blood and seeing how it correlates with incident cardiovascular disease. In this case, we're going to look at incident heart failure for the first study, incident type 2 diabetes for the second study, for the next 2 studies. And then there's a freshman study we're going to look at. And finally, the review paper. So for the first study in heart failure, this was published in 2006. And they measured all of these different molecules in people's blood. And unfortunately, they didn't measure erythritol levels. They only measured the ratios between the controls and the heart failure groups. So it's hard to know exactly what our erythritol levels were doing at this point in time. However, the erythritol levels in people with heart failure were 2 times higher on average than the erythritol in people who were controls. And this is another way to put it. So Tro, you might like this one. Over here is actually NBNP, brain natriuretic peptide. So for people who are listening along, there's a graph on this page that shows all of the different metrics they saw and how they correlate with heart failure. And we have this one lab that we always get on people coming in with heart failure to the hospital to see how bad their exacerbation is. And almost one of the things more closely associated with that, just a few couple of molecules away, is actually erythritol, which is seen in the middle of these, right in the middle. So essentially, if you look at the statistics for this, the BNP that we use to measure heart failure exacerbations is one of the best things we can measure. Erythritol is actually not too far behind. It's still a pretty sensitive and specific test to measure if somebody has heart failure. So the next 2 studies look at metabolomics. So yeah.
Can we just say, so that implies what the case you're building here is that implies a high level of erythritol in the blood just merely is a marker of ill health. Right? That's the implication here, right?
That is my takeaway, and we're going to get into why that would be. It's in the review paper too. Yeah, that would be my that would be the point I'd be trying to get across. So then, not to spend too much more time on these two studies as well, but you can see here that this study looked at incident type 2 diabetes and erythritol doses. So they basically measured metabolites at baseline and followed people to see who developed type 2 diabetes. And there was a 1.3 odds ratio with having an elevated erythritol level and developing incident diabetes sometime in the future. I want you to also keep in mind, if you look right above this, leucine, isoleucine, and proline, you have amino acids above it that are actually associated with a higher odds ratio of type 2 diabetes. And that's going to be important for a point I'll make later. This is the second metabolomic study for diabetes, where they also looked at erythritol. And you can see it over here. It actually met the line of clinical significance just barely for people who developed incident type 2 diabetes. But if you also notice, again, you have your amino acids that are actually much more predictive of your incident type 2 diabetes over here. So the higher the levels of your BCAAs, which are valine, leucine, and isoleucine, and then just an amino acid asparagine in your blood, the more likely you are to develop type 2 diabetes.
Oh, but that's such a complicated discussion.
Exactly.
So
yes, that's going to be the point of these two metabolomics. These are actually perfect molecules to compare to erythritol. They're both available in your food supply, and then you can also measure them in your blood. The BCAAs are they're only from your diet. So the pathway that these go through are altered in people who go on to develop type 2 diabetes. It's not saying that increasing the intake of these amino acids causes diabetes. It's saying that they're risk markers in the blood for developing diabetes.
But the acute ingestion of amino acids, are cleared relatively quickly, and do they result in platelet aggregation and thrombin activation would be my questions, I guess.
Yeah,
it comes back to like sugar and diabetes, right? So, sugar is naturally made in the body, and the nature of the disease is how quickly we process that and put it away.
Yeah.
It's not the substance per se, but the interaction with the substance in our body. What makes cadmium, potentially non-ideal for heart disease, the fact that we can't clear it effectively, and it's associated with significant disease. Okay, so having high levels means, could mean bad things, but not necessarily, I guess.
Yeah, I think the point I think all of this is trying to get across as well is it just a risk marker for disease and it otherwise is not causative, or it's just an innocent bystander, or does it actually cause the disease in question?
It would have been great if in the actual study that showed the hazard ratio of 3.2 in the US cohort, if they had actually seen how many of those people consumed erythritol, tried to quantify it in some possible way, versus those that did not, and actually compare those groups, because maybe the individuals that had the highest erythritol levels actually never even consumed artificial sweeteners. Maybe they kept with their regular sodas and normal things.
Yeah, I wonder, going back to sort of metabolomics, could they, or I thought they did, I don't know where I got this impression from. I thought they had controlled for, some other artificial sweetener in the blood. And if they had done that, for me, that would have clinched it, right?
That would have been helpful. Yeah.
Right? Because then, you're basically taking all comers who would have used an artificial sweetener, right? Which would likely have been the same person, right? And you're controlling for that. And we should ask the authors, if they considered that at least.
Yeah. It would have definitely raised my eyebrows more, and it would have definitely been helpful. And the to your point again, I'm not saying that BCAAs are causative of the of diabetes, or that you need to decrease your risk or decrease your intake of protein to decrease your risk of type 2 diabetes. I think there are molecular mechanisms that get out of balance when your body starts to become more metabolically unhealthy. And a downstream effect of that is that these amino acids are building up in your blood. And that is a risk marker, but not a risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes.
Well, I know they've done studies in rats where they basically overdose them on branched chain amino acids and cause insulin resistance. I just don't know in the modern human diet. And, again, you always have to think about what does it displace? So if you're having huge protein loads, right, what exactly is that displacing and how our disease manifests? So I think one theme we always see when we're, talking about cause, eating anything it's not like zero sum. When you take out sugar, you potentially introduce erythritol. When you take out erythritol, you potentially introduce stevia. Like, we cannot control for human behavior. And so when you add a bunch of amino acids in the form of chicken breast, what is that displacing, right? So I think, even when you have mechanistic data, when it comes to food, versus things like, let's say smoking, right? Smoking and alcohol are sort of zero sum. You get them out of your diet, you get them out of your life. You tend not to do, harsher drugs. But with food, we have to consider what is it displacing and what is it being replaced with. And that's something that's hard to control for. So even though branched chain amino acids, we know that in mice, they cause disease, in humans, high protein diets have been shown to decrease diabetes, decrease markers of health, in terms of A1C and blood glucose levels, and they've never really been shown to cause diabetes. So, it's a complicated topic. How do you convey this to, lay people or journalists that bring it up, or the science communicators and reporters who say that branched chain amino acids are evil or erythritol is evil? I'm with you on that. These things are complicated.
Exactly. It doesn't really get across in a nice tweet, which is why we do this. From the paper, this was just part of their discussion, and I'll just read it out. They said erythritol was significantly associated with incident diabetes in the fully adjusted model, which probably reflects a higher consumption of this compound among individuals with a higher risk of developing diabetes. Specifically, erythritol is a low-calorie sweetener that is added to food as a substitute for simple sugars, since it has little to no impact on blood levels of insulin and glucose. I think this is just incredibly lazy science that kind of hand waves the fact that erythritol is higher in these people, probably because they're taking in more erythritol in their diet. It doesn't even talk about the fact that erythritol is higher at baseline in these patients without any erythritol intake in general, because it's a marker of oxidative damage, which we'll get to. This was done in 2017 too. So this was already kind of on the map back then. And then finally, this is actually one of the better studies that I saw, because the question I always had is what is a level of erythritol in humans in a normal healthy human? And this is the only study that I was able to find that in. This study essentially took 172 college freshmen, and they got erythritol levels at the beginning of their freshman year. Some went on to develop the freshman 15 weight gain. Some stayed stable in their weight. They compared the people who went on to develop the central adiposity, the weight gain, with people who did not. They found that the people who gained the weight prior to gaining weight, this is at the beginning of the semester, they had an erythritol level of 60.8 micromole per liter, where the stable adiposity erythritol levels were 4.1. So the people who gained weight had a erythritol level of 60, and the people who did not gain weight had an erythritol level of 4.
So like, so chicken or the egg? Are they using the, was this a challenge? Can you tell me a little bit more about the study?
Yeah, it was just kind of more of an prospective observational study where they measure people's weights at baseline and got a fasting erythritol level, which we know fasting, if they've had erythritol in the past couple of days, doesn't really mean a whole lot.
And when was this?
This was done in
2017.
So basically, I'm just going to put myself in a college in 2017. If I'm gaining weight and I'm putting on, and I have low energy and I feel miserable, I'm probably drinking more Monsters before tests. Is that what this is basically?
This was at the start of the academic year. So theoretically, if you just take all freshman comers, they
whatever, in high school, right?
Yeah.
So
possibly.
So just the people more likely to feel lousy and drink Monsters have higher levels of erythritol. Is that
Possibly.
Is my conclusion wrong here?
Again, I think if it actually said if people consumed erythritol versus never consumed erythritol, the data would be much more powerful.
Got it. Okay.
I think the important thing to note is that when we go back to this study right here, this metabolomic study, this is the one that compared the erythritol, found that there was a 1.66 hazard ratio with diabetes. This was actually this fasting study. This data was collected in 1987. So this was before erythritol was invented as a dietary food supplement. So we know from when people had zero opportunity to get erythritol in their diet, that erythritol levels are associated with incident diabetes. So the question is, where does it come from and why? And that's what this paper really does a good job of talking about. So this was a review paper that was published in 2022. And this is kind of the whole point of this talk. So if you can see this, that's great. But if not, I'm going to try and walk you through it. It's the pentose phosphate pathway. So essentially, you start over here at glucose and you go down through this pathway and you end up at erythritol down here at the bottom right. You don't need to know all of the steps. The most important step, though, is this 2 NAD pH, which, going to the next slide, is actually used to regenerate your body's glutathione. So going back to this again, this molecule, this whole pathway is essentially upregulated when you have oxidative stress, so that you make this molecule here, the same molecule, so that you can create more glutathione, so that you can reduce oxygen species, reactive oxygen species, so you can essentially remove these hazardous materials from your body. So there's this principle in chemistry: when you increase the starting components of a reaction, the end components of the reactions are also going to increase. So the question is, erythritol is going to be high when this pathway is basically upregulated. Is the damage going to be from glucose here? That is the damage we're looking at, going to be from glucose here. Is it going to be somewhere in the middle here? Is the erythritol going to be causing the damage we're seeing? Or is it something downstream of the erythritol? Somewhere in these arrows to the right. So they even mention this. Is this a molecular mechanism, or what is the causal relationship between this association we see with erythritol and central adiposity gain, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease?
So whatever the cause is, more of it doesn't help, though, right? I mean, so you get what I'm saying? So
you said it yourself. Yeah, there was that study that showed. I did not go over the study, but I read it. It's not in this review, that they gave erythritol to people with type 2 diabetes and their endothelial function actually improved. If they were to study endothelial dysfunction in this paper rather than platelet function, we could probably have a different conversation right now.
Yeah. So what would you have liked to see out of this, and sort of where do you well, actually, I'll let you finish up. So go ahead.
We're almost there. That's the discussion part. This is the whole point. I personally think, just off of this, off of what we're discussing here, that it's probably the type 2 diabetes, you are most likely having metabolic changes that increase your pentose phosphate pathway, that increases your erythritol, that you can use as an early marker of diseases, but you're already developing the diseases by the time that's upregulated.
And then by that time, your level of erythritol, so it's sort of like, insulin resistance and diabetes, your level of sugar is to the point where consuming sugar is harmful, right? It's disease, and but I guess that's the the best case scenario. I think that's my interpretation of this. Mm-hmm. But go ahead, keep going.
Exactly. So I think these are the last three parts of this paper. I just wanted to review the discussion part of this paper where they specifically talked about erythritol in metabolic syndrome, causal or adaptive. There was one single rodent study where they fed rodents either 33% sugar or a 4% non-nutritive sweetener, which had 99% erythritol in it. And these mice had greater visceral adipose mass, cell size, and leptin. Unfortunately, in humans, the paper goes on to say that there's really no data in humans that really kind of support that kind of phenotype. It specifically says there's a scarcity of data on the metabolic effect of chronically elevated serum erythritol from dietary sources. We need to further research administering erythritol alone to distinguish if chronic dietary erythritol consumption has an effect distinct from acute doses. It goes on to say that erythritol synthesis could be an adaptive mechanism to counter oxidative stress induced by obesity and high blood glucose. And the pentose phosphate pathway contributes NADPH to de novo lipogenesis and reduction of glutathione, which is the body's primary endogenous antioxidant. And finally, dietary erythritol could provide feedback inhibition to the endogenous erythritol synthesis, or it may simply confound serum erythritol measurements. So all of that's to say, we're on slide 43 right now. All of that to say is we don't know.
So
we just don't know.
I remember when there was this joke about giving statins out with Big Macs. Should we be giving out, glutathione and aspirin with Monster?
With Monster, exactly. Our Quest bars or things like that.
Yeah.
Maybe this is that table that I talked about earlier. So this lays out all of the different micromoles we just talked about. So at the very bottom, you have the quote unquote healthiest people, the lowest buckets of people who had the buckets of the lowest people that had the lowest erythritol serum levels, the freshmen that did not gain adiposity. These numbers are essentially 4 and below.
Adiposity just means fat.
Yes, increase in weight gain.
Thanks for translating to human talk, Laura.
Yeah. Sorry. I got to get better at that, guys. In the middle, you have all of their platelet reactivity data, where everything, the G2, the 2B3A activation, which just means the platelet activation happens at 4.5 all the way up to 45 micromolar. And then the fourth quartile of the US cohort has an upper limit of 46, but note the lowest limit was also 5. So that's kind of a wash. The freshman with the highest weight gain had 60, a median of 60. The European cohort went all the way up to 137 micromole. And finally, the loading dose of erythritol had 5,000 micromole, 30 minutes to an hour after ingestion.
This graph is so important. Can you guys snapshot this and put this on social media? Because I think this comes back to the precautionary principle, right?
Yeah.
Like everybody can't eat everything. And it just makes me think that, nutrition is so complicated, right? But here's the problem. The problem I have is people who go on to say like sugar's not the issue, right? Sugar's not the issue. But we know so well, we have feedback immediately, right? That some people cannot tolerate sugar, right? And you have the same people who would say erythritol is fine, don't worry about it, would say that sugar is fine, right? And they truly believe this, right? And the problem is we know that there's evidence to say it's not fine in some people. You know, it's like saying peanuts are fine. Right? Peanuts are fine, but there's a ton of people with peanut allergies.
Yeah.
Not everybody can eat everything. And to me, I mean, this says, like, I don't want, you know, I personally don't care if I have a, you know, 60 millimolar, is that a millimolar, micromolar? What is
Micromolar, yeah.
Micromolar, sorry, micromolar amount of erythritol. But, you know, I don't want a 5,000 level for 3 days.
Exactly.
You know, and I certainly don't want it if I have coronary artery disease.
Exactly.
Right? Either that or I want aspirin. So you know, so the thing is that, you know, not everybody can eat everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so when somebody goes on and says, you know, this is completely, you know, normal, it's completely fine, and, you know, this is reverse causation. I think they're missing some of the parts of this paper that are pointing to, you know, at the least, those are quartiles. That's 25% of a population.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe it's a sick population, but like most of America is sick.
Yeah.
You know, and like this is average college people you're presenting here. These aren't incredibly sick people. I mean, these are average, like, and when I mean average, literally 40% of adolescents, which are the people going into college, have, you know, are overweight or obese. They probably have a level of 60. Mm-hmm. Right? What exactly is, you know, 3 cans of Monster doing to them?
Yeah. Almost 2 orders of magnitude higher erythritol levels after loading, which I struggle to think of much else in the human, in just the human body that goes through that amount of difference in levels, if that makes sense, like difference in concentrations after eating something. It's mind-boggling.
Well, that we can measure. This probably has happened, you know, for a lifetime, right? You know, for all of eternity, we just didn't measure it. Now we can measure it and sort of, but this graph is so important because it just, it, you know, sort of highlights, you know, what exactly we're talking about and the relation of sort of the naysayers and what they would say. And, you know, the people who are most likely, well, bottom line is, you know, this shows to me, you know, that we need precision nutrition, mm-hmm. you know, and we need it now more than ever. But anyway, I want to let you finish off here. I'm yapping away.
The last couple of slides here, we're almost done for the people who are still with us, are the discussion slides. So we already discussed a lot of this, but just to hit the high points, I have essentially discussion points for people who are proponents of this study to consider and for people who are opponents of this study to consider. So for the people who like this study, really some of the only new data they provide here, which is, I think, is really important data. I saw people, like, you know, generally poo-poo the in vitro, which means in the test tube, in the Petri dish data. But I think for nutrition science, at some point you do rely on that, because nutritional epidemiology is not the most precise way to get this information. But that is the only new data that this paper really discussed, is the platelet aggregation data. We knew everything else. We knew that if you load people with erythritol, their levels go up basically supraphysiologically, which means much higher than your body would ever make. The next part I would say is it's impossible to know truly if the endogenous or exogenous erythritol is the culprit, and even if it's causal. And then finally, we really don't know, as Laura said earlier, if the people with the highest amount of erythritol levels actually ate or drank more erythritol, because that nutritional epidemiological component wasn't done. But even if they did, I'd probably say it's still impossible to know because that data isn't really too robust, in my opinion. For opponents of the study, for people who kind of say this study is worthless, I think the fact that it was still significant hazard ratio higher than any other nutrient that we consider like damaging to the heart, it was still significant after controlling for traditional CVD risk factors and subgroup analysis. I think that that means I think something else is probably going on here than just saying that it's all of it's endogenous. And I think the thing I'm most frustrated with after doing all of this PowerPoint is that we are putting things into our body. We are putting things into the world food supply that we literally don't know anything about. We were taught in medical school how to study things rigorously, how to make sure you're doing the best thing for the patient, how to make sure you're first doing no harm. And I don't know if the food industry is just not held to the same standard as we are, because this is a gigantic experiment on the American population.
Can I ask you a question? So
Yeah.
when I was looking at sort of how the hazard ratio adjusted, for triglycerides, for example,
Mhm.
HDL, LDL, obesity, diabetes, right? Like there wasn't the only thing that seemed to adjust somewhat was kidney disease. And what hit me was, and certainly age didn't adjust too much either. I wonder, why do you think that these, when they're doing a sensitivity analysis, right? Immediately that when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, why don't they adjust for some other thing a sick diabetic, tired person is going to be ingesting? Like when they're looking at meat, for example, I always wonder, why didn't they adjust for people who take a multivitamin? People who are like generally health conscious, right? Why don't they adjust for people who go to the doctor regularly, right? When they're doing these observational studies. And so it just strikes me as, does it eliminate any effect and then they can't publish a study? Does it, I wonder why they wouldn't do that, because the first thing that I think about here is, well, kidney disease, clearly is affecting this. So to some degree, it's how well does your body clear this and how sick you are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And then the other part of it is, well, okay, fine. The people likely to use these are going to be sick, tired people, right? Who's going to drink a Monster? Who's going to have a diet, a diet product, like a Quest product? It's going to be somebody who's either diabetic or on their way to diabetes or feels miserable from metabolic syndrome and adiposity. So, you have all this data on blood levels. Why don't you just control for another one that rides along with it? And I just, I wonder why these nutrition, is it because they can't publish it then? Or, I often wonder, is it, does it lower the sample size or the effect so much that it becomes insignificant and then they can't make a publication? Like, what do you think's why not do that?
I think you send that question on Twitter to the authors.
Are they on Twitter?
I don't know.
Hopefully.
I think
it's because it's a great point. I've seen people do secondary analyses, like our primary outcomes, secondary outcomes for far more trivial things. I just think at the end of the day, there is a lot of p hacking that goes on in a lot of these studies. I'm not saying these particular authors did it, but in general, if it is not to a T on clinicaltrials.gov, where they have to register these trials and say exactly what they're going to do, which, by the way, you don't have to do with observational studies, only with randomized control trials. They can basically.
Well, you can register the endpoints on Open Science Foundation. So like you can, before you examine a data set, you can state what you're going to look for it. So look at it for. So that is something that can be done, you know. And
but will.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. It's hard, you know. And plus, well, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
So the rest of the discussion as well. So this study does not show that dietary erythritol causes heart disease because they just didn't measure the dietary erythritol. And as you said earlier, Tro, again, there's that one study in type 2 diabetes that shows that it may actually improve endothelial dysfunction.
I mean, there's a lot of things that make platelets clumpy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's literally tons of normal physiologic things that make, you know, like intense sprints can make your platelets clumpy, right? I mean, I don't buy it, but there's a story being weaved here.
Yeah.
That's more than, hey, erythritol's fine. You know?
Yeah, and I just want to point out that TMAO has been shown to cause platelet clumping, yet salmon is one of the highest sources of TMAO, and salmon is thought to be extremely healthy. So you just have to be a little bit cautious with things acting one way in a petri dish versus where everything is coming from in our diet.
Well, I mean, that's a perfect example because EPA, right? High doses of EPA have been shown to at least stabilize coronary artery calcifications. So it could be that you get a little TMAO and you get a little platelet aggregation, but the EPA from those foods are giving you some sort of counterbalance. In this case, we add erythritol to foods.
Without counterbalancing it.
Right. Well, it's not counterbalance. Often there is some counterbalance, right? So a product manufacturer is making a protein bar, right? So they're adding protein to that erythritol, sort of give the person, so they're trying to balance human behavior and health, right? Otherwise, why would they use erythritol, right? They could have just used sugar.
But they're not using an antiplatelet with.
Yeah, correct. Not necessarily using, but I mean, the question becomes is, you know, the products that, well, anyway, you know, bottom line, it's not zero sum.
Yeah.
And I agree with you to have caution, but I'm going to tell you personally, maybe we can answer this question. We did it with Dr. Nick Norwitz and Dr. Adrian Soto. Reduce, eliminate, or wait?
I think we answer this question at the end of the PowerPoint.
It's almost there.
We're not done?
It's almost there. Got Tro. Give me 5 more minutes.
All right, I'm interrupting New Yorker.
You're good.
Yeah.
You're good. You're good.
You just mute. No.
I'm going to mute it here.
All right. So we already talked about this, but the asymmetrical amount of research money and time that has been spent on other things that have been in our diets for decades, millennia, versus all these new novel additives in our food supply is frustrating as somebody who's trying to help people obtain their optimum health, because we just don't have the information. And by this time, erythritol has been around for almost 3 decades. And we're still getting this platelet aggregation data in 2023. This one was tongue in cheek. I was going to try to get your goat with this one, Tro, but the BCAAs are associated with type 2 diabetes incidence. Should we stop eating protein? We already talked about that with a resounding no. And then essentially one of the main parts in the discussion of this paper is that even with nutritional epidemiology, it's really difficult to know how much erythritol people are taking in, because it's not required reporting on the back of a nutrition label. You don't need to break it down into aspartame or erythritol. They can just say sugar alcohols, and then who knows what's what. So you can't even study things that you can't measure. So we need to change our food reporting requirements before we get anywhere with the rest of this. And finally, erythritol is a really, really good marker of cardiovascular disease. I think that's the
order erythritol level on your
I mean, when are we going to get the at-home erythritol level I can take daily to see when I'm going to get a heart attack?
Well, so you know, if you so go back to that, but you know, it's quartile. It's 25% of the. You know, it wasn't like the top 1% of sick people, right?
But also with the recent study of 93% of people have some component of metabolic syndrome.
I guess it's unsurprising then.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, there's something to be said. You know, there wasn't a huge, like quartiles 1, 2, and 3 were basically like the same line,
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly. It makes me think something's going on in that higher group. That it would be more impressive if the data was a dose response, but it's not totally a dose response for the observational data.
Yeah. So
Okay.
that brings us to the last slide, and then your question.
All right. So I was actually looking for where Hippocrates said, "First, do no harm." He actually never said that, and that's not in the Hippocratic Oath, but he did say something kind of similar. Essentially, the moral of the story is that we, as people that are trying to take care of people's health, have to essentially know everything that's happening now and try to predict the future. And then we have to weigh those against doing good or at least doing no harm. And that's basically the kind of oath that we took as physicians to take care of people. And I think with that respect, to go back to your maybe you increase erythritol, but increase, reduce, or eliminate, or keep the same. I would, as long as you can have a plan with your patients or yourself on what you're going to transition to, I think you, for now, eliminate it just based off of the precautionary principle.
Eliminate.
Yeah.
Laura, you're eliminate?
So we have things in our house right now that actually have erythritol in them. I have not thrown them away, but I do not plan to purchase more things with erythritol in them going forward until I see more data.
What do you think, Dr. Tro?
I've had 2 food companies ask me, and I said, why not move away from it?
Yeah, I think
why not?
Stevia, monk fruit for now is allulose. That's going to be my go-to, when I have that craving for something sweet, but I still want to.
You know what sucks is it's just kicking the can down the road.
I know, until the study comes out that says allulose.
That's all it is, right? It's kicking the can down the road a little bit. And so I will say, though, in highly food addicted people who are binging on sugar and have diabetes, I still think I wouldn't hesitate, but I would, again, say the goal is real food, when possible. And then, I have patients who tell me sometimes, that they went from smoking to not smoking to enjoying a cigar on special occasions. And that's a win for me. And, I just tell them the goal is have none, right? The goal is have none. And where they are in their journey, I leave that up to them.
I think that's a good point. And I should, I might, for me personally, say that I'm going to try to eliminate once, it's out of my house. But if I have, I have a patient whose sugars are running in the 300s and they are eating cookies, giving them a erythritol cookie, if I can get their sugar become a flat line of 80 versus a running at 300. No, I don't have data to say that's better, but I think hopefully that's better. And then at least we can slowly wean off the cookies or transition to cookies with less erythritol in them. But
I think it just makes us question a lot of what we do. I think precision nutrition is coming, and this just highlights the need of it. Guys, thank you so much. This was really in depth. And Dr. Matt, you put a lot of effort into this. All I can say is, we need to keep having this high degree of rigor. I will say, I was definitely gonna eliminate to probably should eliminate after you make your best case, but I'm still why not? Why not get rid of it?
Yeah.
Why not? Any last words?
No, I think it's been said. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for spending your Saturday afternoon with us.
Matt, any parting words?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Just trying to improve your metabolic health. And if you can use this as a bridge to something else, that's excellent. But, probably should reduce in the long term, but whatever improvements you can make are always going to be beneficial in the long term.